All right, that is up and running. Let's adjust my seat. Give it one more minute for people to log in from the Zoom or YouTube link. And then we will get to our study for today. If you are playing along at home, you can open up Sefaria to Deuteronomy 6, verse 4, or of course you can use any other Chumash, Torah copy that you might happen to have, whatever translation you might be in favor of. And while we're just waiting, I always like to share a little bit of how to use Sefaria, but if you want to ever change your translation, you can click on any verse, go to translations, and here you can see we're using the JPS 2006, but if you wanted to use Everett Fox's or the Koren translation or the Metsuda or the older JPS or the Rashi Chumash or the old JPS 1917 or even go for the community translation. And then if you speak other languages, you can see there are other languages here at the bottom. But I've been enjoying using our Everett Fox translation for the last few, so we're going to switch over to him. And pick up here. So that's just your little Sefaria tutorial for today. So, like I said, good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for joining me. Today, we will be finishing off our discussion, which we've done for a number of different portions recently, about the entry into the land of Israel and some of the rules and things about this. As you can imagine, Moses is quite worried that as the Israelites go into the land of Israel, when they are no longer under God's protective care and they disperse to get down to the working life of a person, that there will be, shall we say, dissent, there will be disappointment, people might abandon Judaism, and so he is really trying to both give exhortation to the people as well as remind them of their different duties and obligations. So with that as our context, let us go ahead and begin. I will point out that we're going to focus much more than you might imagine on modern issues with that as an introduction, but just stick with me and we will get there. So Deuteronomy 6, verse 4, very famous line, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hearken, O Israel, Adonai our God, or Adonai is our God, Adonai is one. It's the age-old difficulty of translating Hebrew when it looks like there should be a present tense verb to be. Hebrew doesn't include one of those, and so it has to be inferred. Different translations will come up with different ways to reconcile this. This is not just a statement of God's unity and God's absolute unity of essence. This is also a preamble to a reminder to the people of Israel. The word Shema, here translated as hearken, is probably the best English word. It doesn't just mean notice what I am saying. It means take what I am saying and turn it into action. And that's really what the verb Shema means in a context like this. Hearken means to be obedient to what has been heard. And then it goes on. So you are to love Adonai, your God, with all your heart, with all your being, with all your substance. And these words which I myself command you today are to be upon your heart. So we begin with the sort of ethereal transcendental, that we are to dedicate ourselves to God in every possible way that can be done, and that we are to allow the words that Moses is reminding us of from Torah to be in our heart. Very nice, but there are practical implications. You are to repeat them with your children and to speak of them when you're sitting in your house and in your walking in the way, in your lying down and in your rising up. This is the idea that you're going to begin regular life when you enter the land of Israel, and Torah needs to be a constant companion, and it needs to be something that is constantly taught. It is not something that is just going to happen spontaneously because you feel passionate. Judaism, well, religion of all type, needs education. But more practical reminders: you are to tie them as a sign upon your hand, and they are to be for bands between your eyes. This is the origin of the mitzvah of tefillin, the leather boxes that are worn on our arms and our heads. You can check out my Pathway to Judaism class on tefillin if you want more, or one of my videos on worldwide rap. And you are to write them upon the doorposts of your house and on your gates. This is, of course, where we have the mitzvah of mezuzah, as mezuzah is the Hebrew word for doorpost. And all of these, as you can imagine, are meant to be reminders that are going to be very, very important as we move into this strange new situation, this new way of living in the land of Israel. Very different than how we had been living Bamidbar, in the wilderness of Sinai. Any questions, brief questions, because obviously there is so much more to say about the Shema and the Ve'ahavta before we continue.
Quick
Yeah.
question. The writing them, does that presume a level of literacy?
Well, yes and no. It presumes a level of literacy in the sense that someone needs to be writing these things. And we do have from archaeological records the vague notion, because we don't have great records from this time period, that people were at least semi-literate to quite a high level. We see notes being written on potsherds and things like that. So we don't know exactly how literate everyone was, but they would have been quite literate. However, what we really know is that everybody would have known these words. Indeed, even in the modern world, where Hebrew literacy is unfortunately not where I would love it to be, many, many people know the words of the Ve'ahavta by heart. Many of them can even translate it fairly accurately by heart. And I believe that something would have been similar even for those that were not fully literate in the ancient world. They may not have been able to read every part of the Torah with perfect accuracy, but something like the Shema and the Ve'ahavta, as included in the mezuzah, that would have been familiar to them, and they would have known what it meant, even if they wouldn't be able to read other passages. So it doesn't have to be universal college level literacy. It can be semi-literacy or even illiteracy, but the knowledge of the item and what it meant would have been universal. But now we pick up, continuing, not in a completely different topic, but continuing on. Now that we have laid the groundwork, if you will, for what we need to be doing to remember God and be connected to God as we go into the land of Israel, Moses continues to discuss what going into that land is going to be like and some of the emotional and spiritual pitfalls that are going to be present. Now it shall be, when Adonai your God brings you to the land that he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, to give you, meaning the land that was promised to be given to you, towns great and good that you did not build, houses full of every good thing that you did not fill, cisterns hewn out that you did not hew, vineyards and olive groves that you did not plant, and you eat and you are satisfied. So this is a very extended clause within the idea, but at the same time that Moses is reminding us that we'll be going into the land that God is giving to us because of the oath that he swore to our avot, our ancestors, he is also reminding us of what we're going to find, and doing so in a way that is meant to humble us, to remind us that the things that we are about to come into possession of, we did not build with our own two hands. These are being given to us also, not entirely by our own merit, but because of the merit of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. So this is a very humbling statement, even while it is also a very generous statement, by reminding us of what we are about to receive that is being given to us because of a debt God owes to our ancestors, and that what itself is being given was not created with our own two hands. This is meant to generate a great deal of humility. But there are a number of things that are going to pop up, meaning these towns that are great and good and full of all good things in these houses and cisterns and vineyards and olive groves, we get to eat from them. Well, are we eating from the houses that are full of all these good things? How? Are not these houses full of things that are not kosher, both in the literal sense of the term, meaning they could be full of bacon. They could be full of beef, but the beef was certainly not slaughtered according to the Jewish custom. The plants may or may not be planted according to Jewish practice. So am I really allowed to enjoy all of these things? It says I can. I'm supposed to eat and be satisfied. We're not going in and destroying everything under cherem, which we talked about earlier. This is not, we're not proscribing the entire possessions and all of the towns. We are allowed to benefit from this. And what of the idolatry that is present in these houses? They're statues made of gold or silver or other precious metals. What's our relationship to those things? We just get them? Is that a good idea? Well, it is precisely because of some of that latent question, which we're going to go into much more detail in our commentary, that verse 12 continues this conversation. Take care lest you forget Adonai, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of a house of serfs or out of a house of bondage. So we are now going to be given a, not exactly a caveat, but a warning. You get all of this amazing stuff, but you should be humble about it. But while you're getting all this amazing stuff, which you're going to really enjoy, you also need to be on special guard. And you need to make sure that you don't forget. Anytime it says, Pen tishkach, that be careful lest you forget, it always means that there is a greater potential under these current circumstances to become forgetful of God. And in fact, anytime it says that we are satisfied, that idea of us potentially forgetting God seems to be not far behind. So this whole section fits together linguistically and by stylistically very, very harmoniously. And God continues in verse 13, or rather Moses speaking on behalf of God, Adonai, your God, you are to hold in awe. Him you are to serve, by his name you are to swear, meaning don't take oaths by other people's gods or their idols, and don't serve other gods or idols as you come into possession of their places of worship and even maybe the idols themselves. 14 continues, you are not to walk after other gods from the gods of the people that are around you. Here it is. For a jealous God or a passionate God is Adonai your God in your midst, lest the anger of Adonai your God flare up against you and he wipe you out from off the face of the earth. You are not to test Adonai your God as you tested him at Massah, the place of testing. Keep the commandment of Adonai your God and his precepts and his laws that he command you. You are to do what is right and good in the eyes of Adonai in order that it may go well with you, so that you may come and take possession of the good land that Adonai swore to your fathers. So you can see how this all brings it together, that the possession of this land and the goodness that we are being given is conditional upon the observance of the commandments. And here the observance of the commandments seems to be re-emphasizing the allegiance to God exclusively, solo monotheism, and of course a rejection of any idolatry or worship of other gods. And in the process, to push out all your enemies before you as Adonai has promised. And thus we get to the part that might be more familiar to many. When your child asks you on the morrow saying, here the morning really mean, or the next day really means like in the future, what means the precepts, the laws, and the regulations that Adonai our God has commanded you? Well, this may be familiar because that is in fact from the questions of the four sons found within the Haggadah. The Haggadah takes the four different types of questioning or teaching that is mentioned in the Torah and puts them into the mouths of four different children. And here we are seeing one of them, reminding us again, like the Shema and the Ve'ahavta before, that our ethical, moral, and religious instruction must begin at an early age and involve our children. Then you are to say to your child, serfs or slaves were we to Pharaoh in Egypt, and Adonai took us out of Egypt with a strong hand. Adonai placed signs and portents and great and evil ones on Egypt, on the Pharaoh and all his house before our eyes. And he took us out of there in order to bring us, to give us the land that he swore to our fathers. So, that's the kicker, Adonai has commanded us to observe all these laws, to hold Adonai, in our God, in awe, and have it be well with us all the days to come, to keep us alive, as is this day. And righteous merit will it be for us when we take care to observe all this commandment before the presence of Adonai, our God, as he commanded us. Finishing with, how do we take that story of the Exodus, the story of the entry into the land of Israel, and how do we narrate that to the next generation? What spin do we give it, to use a modern phrase? What do we emphasize in that? And here you can see the emphasis is on our gratitude for God for delivering us, and our duty to obey the commandments, as it is through their merit that the land is maintained as being good and in our possession. All right, before we get to an application of much of what we've just discussed, are there any other questions or comments? Let me roll back up to where we were, because I know we went through a lot. All right, so as I mentioned, this idea of coming in and finding the towns, the houses, the cisterns, etc., all ready and ripe to go, is not just a statement of humility to us, but it is also a statement of perplexion. How do we relate to what we find? We're not destroying it. We're allowed to use it and be satisfied, but can we really use it? Because wouldn't many of the things that we come across be prohibited for our use? All right. And this is a topic that continues to have important modern day application. And I know that we're not currently in the days of Joshua. I checked my calendar before we started today. And I know that we are currently not fighting the Canaanites in any place in the world. We've talked about that extensively as well. So how can this have a modern application? Well, it depends on how you interpret the particular commandment that's being given here. What permission exactly is being given, and under what circumstances, and for what purpose? Now, unusual for me, I have elected to use a single source for today. Well, when I say single source, it is one source that summarizes many different sources and does so in a way that is much more cohesive than I could have done by just my normal cut and paste from our tradition. So this is a book called Gray Matter. It is a modern book that is looking at modern halakhic issues, modern Jewish legal issues, through the lens, as we must, of our tradition and past. How do we know to act now based on how we have acted in other times, even if what we are doing now is not a familiar situation to us? All right, so let me begin with his words. The Torah makes an astonishing implication in its description of the incredible boon we would find when we enter the land of Canaan. As we read, houses filled with all sorts of fine items, pits or cisterns already dug, and vineyards and olive groves that we did not plant, that we may eat to our satisfaction. The Torah implies that we may eat any of the items we find in the homes of the people of Canaan that we shall conquer, even if the food is not kosher, right? It seems a little shocking. In fact, the Gemara, Hulin 17a, supports this explanation, stating that we may even eat dried pig that we find in these homes. Chazal rule that such is permissible, despite the fact that the Pesukim, the verses, could have been potentially been interpreted as permitting only those items such as vineyards and olive groves, assuming they're not orla, meaning they're not too young to be harvested, which are kosher. So by the Torah's words, and then by our traditional commentary through the Talmud, even though there could have been a simpler, more narrow interpretation, yes, we are given permission to eat from the food that we find there, even if it is in violation of Jewish law, that if it is kosher. All right, now that is a staggering set of permission, as you can see by the author's use of exclamation points. What does that mean in modern circumstances? Well, he's going to give us first Rambam. This is Maimonides, and we're going to look at Ramban, Nachmanides, in just a minute. So let's try and keep those clear. That's a warning to my own lips to make sure I get the M and the N in the right spot. Rambam in Hilchot Melachim, this is from Mishnah Torah, severely limits the application of this halacha. He imposes the following 4 limitations. When are we allowed to do this? The halacha applies only to frontline soldiers, only when located in enemy territory, where the supply lines from the Jewish army are disrupted, only if they are very hungry, and only if there is no other food available. All right, so you might have thought, says Rambam apparently, that you would be able to eat anything that was found in any of these homes, and anyone would be allowed to do so. Not so. By his interpretation of the verse, together with our traditional interpretation from Talmud, his argument is only these frontline troops that didn't have access to normal food, that were absolutely hungry, and that there was no alternative for them to eat, only they were then allowed to eat these non-kosher things. The Kesef Mishneh, one of the commentaries on Rambam, explains that the soldiers are not dangerously hungry to the point that they will die if they do not eat. Rather, they are simply very hungry and they cannot find kosher food. That's an important distinction. Everybody agrees throughout every Jewish law and every Jewish law code that pikuach nefesh, if you are in a state of absolute starvation, you are allowed to eat anything. No problem, no limitations. As long as you're not killing another person to eat them, you are allowed to eat anything that you need in order to survive if you are in that state of starvation. What Kesef Mishneh is explaining that he believes Rambam was also saying was that although they are not dangerously hungry, they're not actually at starvation, they still have permission to eat this other food, that this is not a case of immediate pikuach nefesh. They're not in danger of dying immediately from lack of food, but they are very hungry, meaning it's, not just been a couple hours since they ate. Now, the Netziv, another commentary, explains that the permission granted is due to pikuach nefesh, this danger to life, as being overly concerned about kashrut during war can lead to endangering lives. That indeed the concept of pikuach nefesh can be extended more than just the immediate threat of starvation, because as a frontline soldier, a lack of food, meaning a lack of energy, puts you in danger from the war that you are fighting. So pikuach nefesh does not always have to be an immediate threat that is looming in the next hour. It can be a little bit more generalized than that. Indeed, this whole idea of pikuach nefesh during a time of war is, of course, famously illustrated in the story of the Maccabees, where some of the co-religionists refused to fight on Shabbat because it was Shabbat, and were destroyed by the Seleucid Empire, because if you're not going to fight, and your enemy is, that you are going to lose. The Torah, according to the Rambam's approach, is expanding the definition of pikuach nefesh in a wartime scenario. Soldiers in battle are in a situation of severe stress and must be as alert as possible to preserve their own lives, the lives of their comrades in arms, and the lives of the citizens they are protecting. A soldier that is not properly fed might not fight effectively as he must, and might thereby endanger lives. The scenario described by Rambam was the very unfortunate and regrettable reality encountered by some Israeli soldiers who fought in the 2006 Second Lebanon War. Soldiers were located deep in enemy territory where the supply lines were disrupted. They were very hungry, and non-kosher food was available in the homes they had taken over. So the question then becomes, are they able to eat from that non-kosher food? And with that disruption of supply lines, were they then in a position where they needed to? In fact, he goes on to say, many years ago, I counseled a relative who was assigned to command a security checkpoint in Shomron from the early morning to the afternoon to drink water on Shiva Asar Tammuz. This is the fast day in the month of Tammuz, lest he become dehydrated and incapable of properly executing his potentially life-saving duties. So there are, based off Rambam's interpretation, grounds to not only supersede the limitations of a fast day, but to also eat something not kosher if it is in order to properly be able to discharge the duties of a soldier in active wartime who has no alternative. All right, so that's Rambam's opinion. Any questions or comments on his view so far? All right, well, we're going to find somebody who does have a different view, namely Ramban Nachmanides. So one major impediment to following this halacha of the Rambam is the fact that Ramban rejects his interpretation. They disagree. The Ramban understands that the permission granted has nothing to do with combat conditions or pikuach nefesh. He does not believe that that is at all what is being given permission, or that is not at all the reason why there is permission for eating at this time. Rather, it is specific permission given under specific circumstances for all of Am Yisrael, not just soldiers, to eat the non-kosher food that is found in the homes of the people that were conquered in the time of Yoshua. That this was just for the time of Joshua. According to Ramban, there is no practical relevance of this halacha beyond the time of Yoshua bin Nun, the leader Joshua. The Pesukim's failure to mention war and soldiers may support Ramban's interpretation. After all, if you go back and look at our verse, it doesn't say when you enter the land and are fighting, you can eat these things. It just says when you enter the land, you'll find it and you can eat it. Therefore, we shouldn't read this as being an extension of pikuach nefesh and illustrative of combat conditions. Instead, we should read this as a one-time only permission that was given to the entirety of Am Yisrael as a result of the conquest of the land of Canaan, soon to be Israel, only in those days. Now, we offer two explanations for why the Torah, according to the Rambam, granted such permission to our ancestors. After all, Rambam had a very good explanation. It was a dangerous time. People need to be able to be at full capacity to fight. This would have been available. Of course, they get permission. Why would just Joe Shapiro walking into a formerly Canaanite home and seeing a lovely bit of pork sitting there, why would he have permission to eat from the non-kosher food? His life's not in danger. He's not a soldier. What's going on? One possibility is that this permission demonstrates the principle of Yalta from Chulin 109b, that for everything forbidden, there is a permitted counterpart. The examples he offers include chelev, fat of a chaya, that is to say, a non-domesticated animal, such as a deer, which is the kosher counterpart of the forbidden fat, the chelev of a behema, which is a domesticated animal, which is not permitted because it was used in the sacrifices. A part of the permitted shivuta fish, which apparently tastes like pork, which is the counterpart to the non-kosher pig, and dam tohar, which is the counterpoint of dam nida. There are some types of blood, when seen, that prohibit intimacy between couples, and some types of blood that do not prohibit the intimacy between couples. So for everything that is prohibited, there is another version that is permitted. Well, this is one way of looking at it, that yes, for everything that is prohibited, here in this one time, going into these particular storerooms, things were permitted. That's one way of looking at it. Yalta illustrates that the forbidden items per se do not represent the essence of the prohibition. rather are abstaining from eating pig, nida, and chelev, and all the other forbidden items stem purely from obedience to Hashem, to God. The Torah permitted us these counterpoint items to emphasize that we abstain from forbidden foods, not because there was something inherently wrong with them, but only due to adherence to the divine discipline. So with this interpretation that Yalta was the underlying principle, the Israelites were given permission to eat from the things they found, precisely to show that there was nothing inherently wrong with the things that were in the storerooms of these houses, and to say, when you do not eat them, meaning for the rest of our Jewish life, when we are maintaining the prohibition on all of these things all of our other days in our life, we are doing so not because we think that pig is bad, but we are doing so because God commanded us not to eat them. If God commanded us to eat them, we would. If God gave us a window of opportunity to eat them, we can. And when God tells us not to, we don't. We are not making a description of the item itself, if it's good or bad. We are making a decision based upon God's command. We will follow what God commanded. If it's allowed, great. If it's not allowed, great. And we will follow as told, not because it's good or bad in its essence. Questions or comments before we get to an alternative explanation? Personally, I find the Alta principle from Talmud very, very compelling, and highly recommend that people think on this when they are making decisions about kashrut, that they are not denigrating the things that they are avoiding eating or any other prohibited act or deed, but instead are restraining themselves simply because they are a Jew. It is what is asked of us as part of Torah. Another explanation is that Hashem sought to limit the challenge we face upon entering Eretz Israel. We were faced with the enormous difficulty of eliminating the avodah zarah, the idolatry, which was at times quite valuable. As you can see from chapter 7, that some of the idols were made out of gold and silver. Eretz Israel, when controlled by the 7 nations, was awash with avodah zarah, as Devarim 12 demonstrates. It was an enormous challenge for our ancestors, and can be today as well if valuable avodah zarah falls into our hands from sources such as the estate of a non-observant relative or a gift from a business partner, to destroy avodah zarah that sometimes can be worth a fortune. So your great aunt happens to be a worshiper of Zeus, and she has a beautiful gold statue of Zeus, and when she dies, she leaves you this statue that was worshipped. Well, you'd probably like the value of that. But of course, as avodah zarah, that's going to be prohibited under most circumstances. Moreover, the Jews, upon entering Eretz Israel, had not eaten conventional food for 40 years while in the Midbar. They were in the midst of the war to conquer Eretz Israel, and therefore were likely not to have had the opportunity to properly cultivate various crops. Thus, they were very likely subsisting on whatever food they could find. When they conquered a home of a Canaanite, they were confronted with Torah prohibitions and obligations that were enormously difficult to fill. So he paints a very powerful image of, here you have people who have only been eating manna with the occasional quail thrown in, and they are now thrust into what would have looked like a supermarket to them. And while manna sustained and even satisfied, we all know there's a difference between that and enjoying different types of food. The variety of food is a value in and of itself. How do you mitigate the struggle that would have taken place for the Israelites coming into this situation? Under these circumstances, Hashem permitted the lesser of the two evils, consuming non-kosher food in order for us to withstand the challenge of having to utterly destroy avodah zarah, no matter how great its value. So the idea is that God said, look, they're going to come in and they're going to see the gold and the silver, and they're going to see all of the food, and they're going to want both. Well, if I have to choose between having them disobey me on both or having them disobey me on one, but obey me on the other, then I'll pick having them disobey me on the kashrut issue. Let them go ahead and eat the treif and ban the idolatry, destroy the gold and silver. And it'll soon be over. The needs of that moment will soon pass, and then it'll be done. Which of course means that this was a time-locked prohibition, rather than Rambam saying that this is a perpetual permission in times of war and stress. This is a permission that was given only for the needs of that particular community. Support for this explanation may be gleaned from the words of the Ramban, who states, all the prohibitions were permitted to them except the prohibition of Avodah Zarah. This implies that the permission emerges from the concern for adherence to Avodah Zarah prohibition. This is an example of Hashem not imposing a too difficult of a challenge upon us. So, as you can see in Avodah Zarah, Beit Din is similarly enjoined from imposing a decree that is too difficult for most of the community to endure. A very important general principle in Jewish law is that the court, the Beit Din, should not enact a takana, a decree that the majority of the community could not be able to fulfill. Even if they think it's the best thing, if the community simply can't, then they are not allowed to enact such an additional decree. So again, the idea here is that Ramban was interpreting this as being God allowing us 99% of what we find in order to strengthen our resistance against the 1% that we found that was Avodah Zarah, that was idolatry. This permission to violate the less severe prohibition, going on with another couple examples to prove this point, is similar to Eliyahu, meaning Elijah the prophet, permitting the offering of korbanot, sacrifices, outside the Beit HaMikdash, the temple, at Mount Carmel. See 1 Kings chapter 18 for a stunning example, in order to wean the people off the northern kingdom, northern kingdom from idol worship. Very important scene where he stands up to the prophets of Jezebel. Rav Avraham Yitzhak HaKohen Cook similarly explains that the Torah permits killing animals for food in order to stress the severity of the prohibition to murder, which is one reason why Rabbi Cook is often looked as being a proponent of vegetarianism. Before we move on to the sort of conclusion summary that this author is making, any questions? Maybe he's explaining himself very well. You'll notice that modern writing is much more, wordy, that modern authors put a lot more words into their commentary in order to be less ambiguous than some of our others. Of course, that means their books are also a lot thicker. So, halacha l'maaseh, what does this mean for us now? And again, this is one author's opinion, and I will describe my own opinion on the topic as we go through and at the end. It is difficult for poskim, those that make legal decisions in Jewish law, to permit soldiers to follow the Rambam's opinion. So he is saying, Rambam's opinion seems a little difficult. Now, you may notice that he did sort of lean in that way in the beginning, but he is now saying it's difficult to make that a universally accepted opinion. The Shulchan Aruch, about 500 years after Rambam, does not address this issue, as it was not a relevant issue at the time of its composition, when there was, sadly, no Jewish state and nor Jewish army. The Shulchan Aruch, very famously, did not give rulings on all aspects of Jewish law, but only those that were relevant at the time that it was being written. The Aruch HaShulchan HaEtid, which is a much later work, which does address issues of war, strongly objects to soldiers following the lenient opinion in the wake of the many questions he poses against the Rambam's opinion. So he is arguing, no, soldiers should not be permitted to eat non-kosher food. Indeed, Rav Yitzchak Herzog, the Ashkenazic chief rabbi of Eretz Israel during World War II, counseled soldiers who were fighting the Nazis in the Jewish brigade of the British Army to avoid non-kosher food despite the difficulty of doing so. So even though you have Jewish soldiers who were fighting alongside the British to try and stop the Nazi war effort, he was saying, if you are hungry and the only thing to eat is non-kosher food, don't eat it. Again, in the case of starvation, yes, that would always be permitted, but here we're talking about that middle ground where there is hunger and no likely supply of non-kosher food. I'm sorry, no likely supply of kosher food. While praising those who fought in the Jewish Brigade and extolling their important role in fighting the evil Nazis, he reasoned that the Ramban certainly does not permit eating non-kosher in such circumstances, as he would limit the permission to soldiers fighting in a Jewish war. Now, I take issue with the idea that World War II was not a Jewish war. Well, certainly it was not a war fought by a formal state of Israel. There was no Medinat Israel. There was no independent state at the time to declare war and to adjudicate the war. It was a war very much for Jewish survival, and as such, it would be a milchemet mitzvah, a war of commandedness. But I don't want to get into that argument too much. But at the moment, just he's trying to say that even for those who say there might be some leniency, it would certainly only be in a Jewish war. And in his opinion, World War II didn't count as such. Therefore, no leniency is allowed. Going on to continue this idea, Rav Eliezer Waldenberg, addressing the challenges faced by soldiers in Tzahal, the Israeli Defense Force, is very reluctant to rely on the Rambam's opinion in light of an insight of Meshech Chochmah. This is another commentary. The Meshech Chochmah notes that the pasuk that follows immediately the Torah's permission to eat the captured items states, "Be careful not to forget Hashem your God." As we go back, remember I pointed out that we have, take care lest you forget Adonai, that there's this immediate warning that comes right after the permission is given. He interprets this as a warning of the possible very negative impact of consuming the non-kosher items, despite the Torah's permission to eat them. He notes that the Gemara, here in Yoma 39a, warns of timtum halev, the spiritual numbing of the heart that occurs as a result of consuming non-kosher items, even when it is permissible to do so. So, unlike our earlier discussion, where he talked about the principle of Yalta that proves that the items themselves have no negative effect, here he is quoting a different opinion, which implies that even when permissible, that there is still some form of spiritual contamination from eating things that are prohibited to us. Now, this is a very complicated topic of exactly what's going on here on a spiritual and mitzvah level, because is it that this is numbing because even while permitted, we know that it is prohibited? Or is this numbing because even while permitted, there is something of a spiritual contaminant within the item itself? And that even with permission, that contaminant remains, just like we could also argue, even with permission, the knowledge that you did something that was prohibited is also there, even if you know in this circumstance it was okay. But Waldenberg is using this as a justification to rule against the consumption of non-kosher food during wartime when a soldier is cut off from the normal supply lines. The Meshech Chochmah points to the Shulchan Aruch's resolution of a classic dilemma posed by the Rishonim regarding one who on Shabbat must consume meat to prevent death, but no kosher meat is available. So you have this dilemma. You're about to starve to death, or someone is about to starve to death. You can either give or eat the non-kosher meat that is readily at hand, or slaughter an animal to be able to make it kosher and then feed them from the body. In such circumstances, according to Shulchan Aruch and the general acceptance, one must choose between violating Shabbat, a capital crime, by slaughtering an animal to render its meat kosher, and eating available non-kosher meat, which is a significantly less severe prohibition. The Shulchan Aruch rules that one should violate Shabbat instead of eating non-kosher food, even though eating the non-kosher food is a less severe prohibition. The reason, explains the Meshech Chochmah, is that eating non-kosher food leaves a negative impact on the neshama, on the soul. Now, there are other ways to interpret that permission. The idea being that if you are trying to save somebody's life, that it is not prohibited to slaughter the animal on Shabbat, and thus it is certainly natural to use kosher food rather than the non-kosher option. that to avoid the slaughtering of the animal would be an unnecessary, what's the right word, an unnecessary piety, and that one should move with certainty and confidence that what is needed to save the life is what is needed. I should also point out that if a kosher animal wasn't available and the only option was to use non-kosher food, then certainly that would be allowed on Shabbat or on any other day. And we might still wonder about this negative impact of this Timtum Halev, but it would still be required to save the life. According to the Meshech Chochmah, the permission to eat non-kosher food is implicitly discouraged by the Torah, not unlike the Torah's implicit discouragement of engaging in Eshet Yafat Toar, the taking of a captive wife, described in Devarim 21. He understands the permission as a concession to the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, and as something that maximum efforts should be made to avoid. The Rambam's permission might be compared to the permission to eat on Yom Kippur granted to the one bringing Sa'ir La'azazel. This is the person who was carrying, or not carrying, but guiding the goat that was the scapegoat out to the point into the wilderness where it would be dropped off the cliff. The Mishnah states that food was offered him at each of the 10 stations located on the route from the Beit HaMikdash, from the temple to the cliff. The Gemara notes that no one who walked the Sa'ir HaMishtachaleach ever partook of the food on Yom Kippur, but the very fact that it was permitted to us helped them because of the paradoxical principle of Eino domeh mi sheyesh lo pat b'salo lemi she'ein lo pat b'salo, that one who has the option to eat, or literally has bread in his basket, cannot be compared to one who does not have bread in his basket. The idea being that it's easier to control our worst inclinations when the opportunity is presented to us, because then we can say no to it. But if we are not given that option, then that desire to have it sort of will build unchecked because there is no opportunity. Psychologically, it's like if you always have a bowl of candy on your counter, it becomes easier to control your consumption of candy. Whereas if you don't, when you come across some candy, you will throw yourself on it with reckless abandon. When one is given the option to eat, he is less desirous of the food than he would have been had it been forbidden to him. Similarly, it is possible that even the Rambam believes that the Torah permits the soldier to eat non-kosher food when behind enemy lines in order to paradoxically help him resist the temptation to eat non-kosher food. So in the end, our author was arguing that even Rambam didn't really think that the soldier should eat the non-kosher food when behind enemy lines, and that he only said you have permission to eat it to make it easier for the soldier not to eat it. Sort of playing a psychological game with the soldier, making him making him more resistant to the temptation by giving permission in the first place. Now, any questions or comments on the positions that have been laid out here? Like I said, this is one position. I'll share a little bit more about my own thoughts on this in a minute, but I want to make sure we understand his position first. I'm not seeing anyone in questions or unmuting. All right, so let me give you my breakdown a little bit before we throw it open for broad discussion of this topic or any other that are related. My breakdown in this is that it seems very much like we are seeing here a shift, the transition that has happened in many parts of Jewish law, where Jewish law in the days of Rambam was not exactly cut and dry. There was much debate, much discussion, and it wasn't exactly purely rational in some modern clinical sense, but it was guided by a very concrete sense of what would or wouldn't be happening, what was and wasn't permitted, and those were the most important principles. If it was permitted, it was permitted. If it was prohibited, it was prohibited. If it was permitted under certain circumstances, you should take that at face value, that it was permitted under certain circumstances. And if a soldier is behind enemy lines and no kosher food is available, you eat non-kosher food, even if it means, even if you're not starving to death today, in order to make sure that you are at fighting capacity. The desire to move that position into a more restrictive framing, and the particular use of things like Timtum Lev as being a spiritual reason to avoid it, is something that becomes much more common as Jewish history has progressed. Beginning in the middle and taking off in the late Middle Ages, we became more susceptible to these non-legal arguments that are not about purely interpreting the text as the text stands, but more about trying to create a sense of piety that in many ways have created restrictions that are not intrinsic to the Torah and not found in earlier strains of Jewish law. In the modern world, this has accelerated. I am, quite surprised that somebody, this author is very much a supporter of the state of Israel and of its soldiers, would cause any soldier to ever think twice about doing what was necessary in order to feed themselves in difficult situations. And unfortunately, the soldiers of Israel often will find themselves in difficult situations. So this is where we end up with modern interpretations that have the illusion of piety, which in fact are undermining the original interpretations of Jewish law and making it more difficult, if not more dangerous, to live a good and meaningful Jewish life. Questions or comments?
There's something very modern about this, that when you multitasking is this modern phenomena. And here we have a group of people who have to fight, they have to build houses, they need new cisterns, they need new kosher crops. There's a long list of things that are needed. So we have this kindness with how do you set priorities? And clearly the priority is you need the land first. So their permission is being given here of, okay, the houses, the cisterns, and the crops limited to vineyards and olives. It's more of a permission. Don't worry about these things yet. There is, so how to juggle these priorities. This is a good example. How you have to focus on what is the top priority. The things that are lesser priorities, while you have permission, there's the psychological reason. It frees you up to know that, yes, you can maybe deal with those as your secondary priorities, but it also then creates it easier to push the focus where the priorities need to be. But again, so it's a decree not too difficult to endure.
Exactly. And very much, you can see that this is echoing the problems of the false piety, the exaggerated piety of the days of Maccabees, that also led to disaster. And while I certainly understand and respect the notion that we should not easily or gratuitously give in to the temptation to violate the laws of kashrut or the laws of Shabbat or any of the other mitzvot, there is also a very pernicious danger of wrapping this up in the language of piety. The permission is just a trick to make you able to avoid the temptation, when we're not talking about temptation to eat non-kosher food. We're talking about a soldier that is actually hungry. We're talking about somebody that is in danger and they don't know when they will eat again. And here they have a chance to eat, to sustain themselves, and then be able to defend themselves, their comrades, their country, and putting them in a position where they have to wonder, well, is it here just so I can go on without eating it? Or is it here because I can eat it? It's just clouding the judgment of people that are already in difficult positions. So I am firmly in Rambam camp here. that this was given as permission because it simply made sense, that we should not abuse that permission outside of these types of circumstances or immediate starvation. We shouldn't give in to treif and same things with violating Shabbat and all of that. But we also shouldn't think of it as being fake permission that is just there as a teddy bear to help us get through the night and hold on. That sort of thinking is not helpful to those that actually face these real problems. I don't see any other questions or comments, so I think we're going to wrap it up there for today. I just want to leave with a thanks to Sahal, the Israeli Defense Force, who recently had to fight another round of combat in Gaza, as well as other places as well. But Gaza was the focal point. And may they continue to act with the wisdom of Torah, and may they continue to be supported by our people, and may they be able to always act with nobility, dignity, honor for themselves and everyone else. Take care and be well.
Thank you, Rabbi.